Maybe we need silence.
For 15 minutes.
Okay, Josh, you're good.
I'm sure most of us have experienced a big move as little kids. Through this process, we had to give up friends, relationships, our home, sometimes our furniture, and our schools. If you've ever experienced this, you're probably an interregional migrant or an intra-regional migrant. An interregional migrant moves permanently within a country from one region or state to another. An intra-regional migrant moves permanently within a country, but they remain within the same region or state. Why did your parents choose to move? What would push a family to move from one neighborhood to another? And what would push a family to move from one country to another? Migration of all forms is caused by push and pull factors. A push factor is an undesirable event that causes people to want to leave an area, such as a lack of available work or a distance from family. A pull factor is a desirable characteristic that brings people to an area, such as a high minimum wage or a high proximity to family. When you moved as a kid, your parents were probably affected by pull factors, such as a closer proximity to your extended family, or possibly their jobs. Push factors in this situation may include a high crime rate or being withdrawn from the rest of the community. People who migrate between countries may be pursuing a stable government, or they may be evading discrimination and persecution in their homeland. People who migrate to new countries also may be trying to get closer to their family, or pursue a better standard of living for themselves and their children and their future generations. In the time frame that this lesson is focusing on, there are three main types of migration. Persecution. This occurred in the British Empire when India was granted independence, and split between the Hindu and Muslim religions. Many people migrated the border because of the violence that ensued due to religious differences. This will be discussed more later in the lecture. Forced migration. This occurred when Africans were taken captive and shipped from their homeland to the Americas and Europe. The slaves didn't have a choice. They were forced to migrate, and often they died due to this forced migration on the slave ships. Aggression is also a type of migration. Though this may not be as common in today's day and age, aggressive migration occurs when war pushes a race of people away from an area. For example, the Mongols used warriors to fight the Huns until they migrated west and left their land. To start off, the Great Migration was the movement of 6 million African Americans out of the rural South United States to the North, East, Midwest, and West for most of the 20th century. The Great Migration occurred generally between 1910 and 1930, and about 1.6 million migrants left rural areas to migrate to the north during the Great Depression. A second Great Migration from 1940 to 1970 occurred also, in which 5 million people moved to California and other western cities. During this time, blacks moved from 14 states of the South, especially Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi, to the other regions of the United States. More townspeople with urban skills moved during the second migration, which occurred from 1940 to 1970. By the end of the second Great Migration, African Americans had become an urbanized population. More than 80% of them lived in cities, and a majority of 53% remained in the South, while 40% lived in the North and 7% in the West. In the early 1900s, one of the largest migrations took place in all the United States history, and that was this Great Migration. The African Americans were pushed because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which had just been signed in the North by Abraham Lincoln. It was freeing African Americans in the North from slavery, and African Americans who were in the South were willing to risk everything to try and bring a better life to their families. So they ran away from their owners and their plantations in hopes of reaching the North. I have a map here showing the movement of the slaves. As you can see here, the North is the area above the black line, and the south is the area below the black line. The blue arrow represents the African American slaves and their movement up towards the north because of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now on to the next example. Not long after the events of the Great Migration, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 gave India independence from Great Britain. It was signed on the 15th of August. The 15th of August was the appointed date for the partition. However, Pakistan came into existence a day earlier, on August 14th. The partition of India was set forth in the Indian Independence Act of 1947, as I just said, and resulted in the separation from India from Great Britain. And it also broke apart the British Empire and ended the British Raj. It resulted in a struggle between the newly constituted states of India and Pakistan, and it caused the displacement of up to 12.5 million people, with estimates of loss of life varying from several hundred to millions and millions of people due to religious differences. This hostility was caused between the religious differences of the Hindus and the Muslims. The Hindus were native to India, while the Muslims gathered in the new state of Pakistan. Here I have a picture of the movement from India, between India and Pakistan. Okay, so the blue arrow represents the movement of the Hindus from the Pakistan to India, and the red arrow represents the movement of the Muslims from India to Pakistan. Now, the reason that they were migrating was because their families were being attacked and discriminated against by people of the opposite religion because of negative and harsh feelings towards each other. Now, for a third example, Germany had just gone through World War II and World War I, and they were their economy was totally in the dumps. And they needed a lot of help in their economy, but people needed jobs, and so people were starting to leave Germany to find jobs in other countries. These people were German the guest workers, and they left on visas, and sometimes illegally, to go and work in surrounding countries such as Denmark and France, and even Italy. And these people left temporarily, and their money was sent back to their families, who often stayed in the Germany borders, within the German borders. I have a map to represent the movement of people from Germany to the neighboring lands, which also included Russia. So, these areas, as you can see, they just totally spanned out, diffused from Germany into the immediately surrounding areas to find jobs in better economies where there was a higher minimum wage, with the goal of hopefully bringing home more money to their families so that they could feed themselves. Now, why would people migrate? Is still a bit of an unanswered question. And as you can see, through the 20th century, people migrated because they needed to supply for their families. In the British example, they were trying to supply safety for their families. The different religions were separating in an attempt to give the future generations a better life, because they wouldn't have to worry about violence or hostility from the opposite religion. In the Great Migration example, African Americans were leaving the South, hoping that they could get a new life in the North, and that their families would have better experiences in the north, and that even in some cases that they could buy their families from their owners. And this great desire and need to supply for family drove both major migrations. And in the migration of the German guest workers, there was a desire to bring home extra money for the families. And as for more information on the German guest workers,